Now, all narrative experiences live and die by the strength of their characters, but there's a special attention that has to be paid when composing a visual novel. Working on 10 different visual novel projects, including her latest, Belle Automata, this writer, director, programmer, and mixing engineer has a number of takeaways that she hopes will help you craft more compelling characters. Please welcome Jessinia Saunders.
Hello and welcome to my talk. My name is Jessinia and I am the founder and permanent member of Jellyfish Parade, along with my community manager and producer, Kadira. Currently, we're working on a visual novel called Belle Automata. First, I'd like to say that although this project is a game, it is my hope that this talk will be beneficial to creators of all characters and all world builders. Second, let me briefly explain what a visual novel, or VN, is. Choose your own adventure novel with music, images, and at times point and click mechanics via choices or even mini games. In the romance genre, there are choices that allow a character to be romanced, with the player being given autonomy to assist the character romance love interests and individual storylines called routes. Third, I'd like to just give a disclaimer. These suggestions are just that, suggestions. There are a variety of ways to skin a cat, or in this case, more than one way to develop a story, character, or world. So it is my hope that this talk will be a resource rather than a discouragement. So without further ado, let's begin. I'd like to start with reading a synopsis of Belle Automata. Arev is an android, content with a life of weaving silk tapestries alongside her master. But when he dies, his family sells her off due to her being a rogue, a self-aware android. Thrown into a new home of refuge for rogues, the newly freed Arev must find her place amongst them and answer the question once and for all: how does one weave a new identity when the strings to the old have been cut?
I am the Dreamweaver, Model T95.
Appreciation of any kind would suffice.
Wow, your model is adorable. I've never seen an android like you before. I'm Zafir, and I'll be your neighbor, just down the hall.
Welcome to House Price. How's your first hour been, little lady?
You'll have to excuse me. I was deep in thought.
I know what it's like to feel thrown away. To be thrown away.
So the first thing we're going to step into as far as Belle Automata is concerned is compelling worlds. One of the most helpful things for world building is asking if-then questions. The original story basis for Belle Automata was the Greco-Roman myth Cupid and Psyche, and then later Beauty and the Beast. So the first if-then question for a sci-fi Beauty and the Beast story is this: if Belle is a machine, what could the Beast be? In a sci-fi world, why would a person be reclusive about their appearance? So you can think of roles that would exist in the story. You can think of questions that will lead to conclusions that you can make yourself and open the world to more questions, which can help you develop the story before you begin writing it. Now, I will talk more about the character roles rather than just setting. However, that is something that we'll talk about a little bit later. So here's the first point. If-then statements, if-then questions, and what-if questions can all help a world and its inhabitants develop in an organic way. by asking questions about relationships the characters could have and contrasting them with each other, you can help the player perceive the world more clearly. So an example of this is in the neighborhood of a character named Klaus. He is a doctor, so rather affluent, and the planet that this game is set on is filled with foliage. It's a rainforesty climate, so there are a lot of trees. Now, this is an image that is not quite complete, so you may notice some things are inaccurate to what I'm saying. However, you can notice as well that the neighborhood does look rather affluent, which would make sense considering that the character who lives here is also an affluent member of society. On the other hand, we have a character who is reclusive. So how can we see that this character is reclusive by the world or by the setting? We see that the house is dark and closed off. You cannot see through the windows. You cannot see any other houses around. And because the house is rather large, and because water surrounds the house, you can tell that the person who lives here does not want guests. You can almost think of it as a castle or a protective moat. Now, how does this have anything to do with the world of the game? Well, as I mentioned before, the characters themselves will establish the world. And yes, you can talk about the actual contents of what goes on in the world and how it functions. But one thing that's very important is to make sure that those characters do in fact relate well to the setting. As I mentioned, I will talk a little bit later more about that. Now, if your world has especially rich lore, you do have to be careful of too much exposition or too much information in one particular section of the story. Instead, break up your world building information into multiple storylines or routes. Or if you are not writing a visual novel, you can just break it up amongst character delivery. That would be the different characters that give information to the main character or player character. Now, one of the things that I like to do is instead of directly telling the player, oh, these characters are like this, I do prefer to instead take a more organic approach where, for example, the characters might turn on the television and see an ad. Now, if they see that ad, they can see, oh, these kinds of companies exist. And if a character is related to that company, they can have that little note in their mind. Because most players or readers can understand that there is no reason that a writer or author or world builder would include it unless it's relevant to the rest of the story. So because of that, people will be looking out for those smaller details that have been added into the story. So main characters. First, I'd like to say that while your main character can be any gender, for the purposes of this talk, I will refer to the main character as a she, her, with she, her pronouns, or as a heroine. Now, there are really three types of main characters. Type 1, the blank slate. Now, the blank slate is a reactionary heroine. She has as few as one defining trait and often reacts to the scenario she is put in rather than taking the initiative in her own story. This character is excellent for self-inserters. So if you wish for the character to be up to the player's interpretation, this is the perfect heroine type. Type 2 is the full character. This heroine has a clearly defined personality type with a variety of traits and imperfections. She can move her own plot, and her player-driven choices often have the player decide what she will do rather than who she will be. This character is excellent for role players who want to become the character rather than the other way around. Now, called the glass half full character. As one might expect, this heroine is a combination of the two above heroines. While she does have a base personality and strong defining traits, the player is able to choose how this main character feels and even reacts. This hybrid form allows for flexibility. Now, I should mention that no one heroine is better than another. Rather, the question is, what heroine is best for this story? Now, Arev was originally going to be a blank slate, but after reviewing a survey I put out, it came to my attention that 90% of respondents said they preferred a defined main character. Now, I do admit that my pool was rather small, so you may find that that may vary in the community that you are creating for. However, in my particular community, my particular audience, a defined main character was preferred over a self-insert character or a blank slate. Now, I felt at first that with a sentient android, a blank slate would be the expected choice. But as I was writing the story, her character voice developed as well. She became someone who isn't easily offended, someone who is a little playful, a person who tries her best to adjust to new circumstances, and most importantly, a person who is in touch with her emotions. Now, the topic of grief is dealt with as well, so I wanted a character whose feelings could be felt by the player. Another example is a character called the Nightmare Prince. Now, in the Cupid and Psyche-based version of the game, he was originally called the Nightmare King and was an alien pirate. As the story shifted to being set 5 steps in the future and more normal planetary based, I shifted from king to prince because it was softer and I wanted to. Now, in the original Greco-Roman myth, Cupid is unseen, and Psyche is told that she is married to a monster by her sisters. So my sci-fi translation of this was for him to not have a body at all. But I did feel it would be harder for the audience to connect with that character concept. So that change in the incorporeal or non-physical quality was shifted onto a side character named Zephyr. We will talk more about him later, but for now, I'd just like to give point 5 of this talk, or rather the next point of this talk, which is point 3. Adapt your characters as the story evolves. After Aura was no longer a blank slate character type, I rewrote her earlier interactions to match the personality traits that she was starting to grow. If it helps, work in a feedback loop. My process is to adjust in both ends until character and setting meet in the middle. All right, now we're going to talk about character dynamics and character voice. When determining a plot, it's important to know what purpose your side characters are serving in the overall story, as well as knowing their relationship to the main character. So start connecting the dots between the love interest and the heroine. Why? Because if you do so, you're assigning value to the characters, and most importantly, creating a support system for your main character. Ask yourself, when you determine your plot, what role does this character serve in the story? How often does this character show up? Do you need the character or the role the character plays? Is the character plot essential? If the character doesn't have a real voice in the story, consider cutting them. Personally, I prefer to build up casts rather than paring them down because it is much more difficult to let go of a son than to welcome one. Now, this is the full cast of Belle. You might notice that the characters are color-coded. That's just because I love rainbows. That's pretty much it. So sorry, I'm a little corny, but there it is. Now, starting from the orange theme character, we're going to talk about the role or voice that each of them has. Diego is the voice of comfort. Anytime Aurev is in a position of discomfort or unhappiness, he can serve in that comforter role. Now, Victor, the yellow butler, he is the voice of structure. He is not kind or warm, but his presence is necessary because he keeps the house in order and helps provide purpose to Aurev. Next is the Nightmare Prince. He is the voice of compassion. He is calm, not at all strong-willed, and soft and kind. As such, he can offer empathy to Aurev when she needs it. Now, Zephyr is the voice of levity. This character can bring light to scenes whenever a moment of humor or comic relief is needed to break up drama, or even just to make sure that a storyline doesn't get too dark or have a huge tonal shift. Now, Klaus, he's the voice of reason. He gives advice in conflict, as well as helping characters to make decisions. Now, Roman is the voice of mystery. More than his character role, Roman's storyline will wrap up the story in a found family situation. He brings the characters together, but overall is generally hard to read and has unrevealed motives. Now, by having these roles, no matter what storyline you're writing, you automatically have a support system for the main character. And when I say these roles, I don't mean the roles that I've assigned to the characters. I just mean roles that you assign to your characters. Now, not only that, but whenever you get stuck on how a character would act, you can return to their core story purpose. It means more than serving as a support system to the main character, you're also building anticipation for the reader or player learning more about those characters. Now, I will admit I did make a mistake when I first wrote the Belle Automata demo, because unfortunately the Nightmare Prince is reclusive and Victor isn't warm or friendly. That means that the original demo felt like Aura didn't have anyone on her side in this new life. By giving her a support system of the other androids who have warmer roles, the story is less heavy and feels like a real refuge for androids, not just Aura fending for herself in a place where no one wants her. As a result, I ended up rewriting the demo as well as the Nightmare Princess route. The last thing I'm going to say about the benefits of a support system is that it does not only give texture to the world, but also makes it easier to develop relationships outside of romantic ones. By giving characters non-romantic bonds and roles outside of their storylines, you can make people care about the well-being of the characters more easily, even if they're not on that character's storyline. So that brings me to point 4. Main characters need support systems. By giving the characters around her relationship roles, you can easily develop natural character interactions and form a well-supported, well-rounded setting. So, how characters can be inspired by other media. So originally, as I mentioned, the Nightmare Prince is my interpretation of Cupid, or the Beast from Beauty and the Beast. It stands to reason then that the others are also based on literary characters, and that would be mostly right. Mostly. So for Victor, for example, my thought was simple. If the butler android was romanceable, what other literary Ultimately, I decided on the Tin Man from The Wiz because one of the key points of that character is the fact that he's heartless while being a living person. My other inspiration was Wally. Specifically on the Axiom, the spaceship where most of the movie takes place, Wally encounters a robot named Mo. This robot chooses to disobey its primary directive of cleaning a specific set of androids to follow Wally to clean up his dirt from his filthy treads. Now, although Wally and Mo are both sentient, they express their awareness in very different ways. I wanted Victor to be self-aware, but not necessarily emotional like Areb is. An example of this comes from a scene I really love. In the Nightmare Princess storyline, Alrev is trying to figure out if Victor is sentient or not. She finally figures out that he is, and they have a discussion about him being a rogue. He says to her, I lack a crucial component of rogueship, and that is a wide spectrum of emotion. So she asks him, can you feel it all? And Victor responds, oh, I feel all right, mostly irritation. So although both androids are self-aware, they express that self-awareness very differently. Now, there are other characters that have a literary basis. Just to briefly touch on them, Zaffir's story basis was Pinocchio, because that media has the concept of its main character becoming a real boy, and Zaffir shifts from an incorporeal celebrity to an everyday android relating to that. Except in this case, Zaffir does not want to be a normal person. Klaus is not based off of anyone. Neither is Diego. Those characters were created exclusively for the roles that they provide in the story. And the only other character that has a basis is Roman, who off of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, because just like that novel, one of the main themes in his storyline is the concept of duality and living a double life. So when creating characters, if you have a reference material, use that to strengthen the narrative, but still allow yourself to branch out from your source material. Don't rely on it to the extent that it's a copy. Instead, borrow themes, borrow motifs, and even character basis as inspiration to create something entirely new. So, plotting Belle Automata. Since I had the idea based around literary characters, that made plotting a little easier as I could check the original incarnations for inspiration when I got stuck. Writing out a list of motifs is helpful for this type of theming as well. For example, roses and rose imagery ensure that some players will enjoy these little nods to the original tale of Beauty and the Beast. Now, one difficult thing that I know a lot of writers and world builders struggle with is having a bunch of random scenes in your head with no full plot leading up to them. My advice is to write these things out. You can figure out where they go later. Strong imagery should never be wasted. After those ideas are down, you can assign them to a point in the plot timeline as well as how the scenes can be ordered. Then, in that way, you've started connecting the dots between the love interest and the main character. So ask yourself, how do their worlds interact? Now, Arev is the heart of Belle Automata, both as the protagonist and as catalyst for the game events that change her love interest and herself in their respective routes. By giving the main character that responsibility, you make her an active player in her own story. While being a character dealing with grief after the loss of her master, her love interest can help her develop other aspects of sentience in turn. For example, also lost people he loved, and as such can empathize with her grief, something Victor cannot do. On the other hand, Victor is driven, so he is able to find purpose, another struggle Arev deals with, now being free without one. When you have a support system for the characters, you can form a more organic relationship, even off screen. An example of this is Diego and Klaus. Klaus is a mechanic and psychologist, so he plays the role of doctor for the androids. Diego has an issue with his memory banks, and because of that issue, is unable to function perfectly. If he were to be his problem, but it will also remove his sentience. As such, Diego and Klaus have a working relationship that can be inferred even when they're not on screen together. In any case, each love interest can provide something to Arev and vice versa. As a result, each love interest is changed by Arev herself, so that it's a mutual development of the characters. There is one limitation though. It's important to develop a love interest in their own respective storyline, or just in general outside of the context of the main character. If their development occurs outside of their storyline, if you're writing a novel or a visual novel, there's nothing to talk about when you actually get to them. So with that, I get to the next points. First, don't waste strong imagery. Write out any scenes you have in your head, since you can always rewrite and tweak them later. And next, character relationships are the key to creating a complete setting. Figure out character dynamics. Even if your story is plot driven or if there's no plot at all, strong characters will make the overall narrative even stronger. So let's review. Points 1 through 3. If-then statements and open-ended questions can help a world develop organically. 2, be careful of too much exposition in a single storyline or in the novel or whatever you are writing. Now, if you're world building, there's no such thing as too much exposition. Generally, you can write as much as you want about the world that you're creating because, it's not necessarily meant to be read like a story is to move plot progression in addition to telling the reader about the world that they're in. So have at it. Now, next, it's okay and even necessary to adapt your characters as your story concepts evolve. Points 4 through 7, main characters need support systems. Give the characters around her roles to develop character interactions. If using reference material, use said material to strengthen the narrative, but don't rely on it for the entire narrative. Don't waste strong imagery, and figure out character dynamics as early as possible to make a complete setting. So that is a recap of the 8 points of this slideshow. Now you may have noticed I only read 1 through 7. Why is that? Because there is one more. Have fun. If your story building is stressing you out, take a break, step away from it. You may need to. And if you're not having fun, it will be impossible to finish the story. No matter how cool the concept or how interesting the characters, it's impossible to finish a project you don't love. So love it and use that love to power through the lows. So I hope this is helpful. Please check out Belle Automata when it releases in full. Currently, the first part is out on Steam, available for purchase. And feel free to support us in our other links, including on Patreon, or even join our Discord just to chat. Thank you.
I love how that talk gave us a combination of theory and application to be able to figure out how to craft more compelling characters. It was great hearing how each of those points were implemented in Belle Automata, and I can only imagine the effect those tools will have on the final product. I feel like I see some through lines actually between Jessinia and Emily's talks. I'm betting there could be some great conversations there. Thank you for your talk, Jessinia.